Good morning, everybody, and sorry to keep you all waiting to join us. Welcome to, I think, episode 19. I will say we have, for the last several years, been featuring leaders on issues of environmental, social, and governance. Um, a little bit of note on terminology. We will be changing the name from ESG because unfortunately, not only has it become politicized, but also it has sort of left its meaning. Originally in 2004, it was, the features of environmental, social, and governance that were linked to shareholder value. It now seems to mean all things to all people and often gets conflated with impact. And one of the things I think that is very important is that we don't allow debates over terminology to undermine the need to focus on some of these critical issues because they're critical for shareholder value, they're critical to a company and its operations, and they're critical for our communities and the worlds in which we live. So, with that note, on terminology that is going to shift, I'm Susan McCormick. I'm a partner at Morrison Foerster, where I head our sustainability group and also our impact groups here. I've been practicing for a little less than 30 years, and 25 in this space. So I have seen it grow and evolve. And I've been very honored over the past 30 years to have a close working relationship and now friendship with Aron Cramer. And Aron is the president and CEO of BSR, and he usually serves as a co-host, but we are honored this morning that I'm actually getting to interview him because he really is recognized globally as a preeminent authority on just and sustainable business, what we're often referring to now as responsible business. As president and CEO of BSR, the membership has grown to 300 member companies. And this is not just, your sustainable impact renewable energy companies. This is Shell and Marks and Spencer's and SAP and Nike, and some of the sort of the pillars of our economic structure and our corporations in the United States and globally. And he is on the front line advising them on these issues. He is also on the board of We Mean Business and Rise, and he is just, I think we are very lucky to have him here sharing his views. I'm also very honored that we're joined by María Mendiluce, who is the CEO of We Mean Business, who also has been working in this field for about 25 years. And she really leads a coalition of businesses that are leading the charge to transition to a zero carbon economy, and works with over 20,000 companies around the world to reduce emissions, and brings a business voice to global platforms, including Davos last week. She has a PhD in energy economics, and she's a commissioner on the Energy Transitions Commissions. I think both of them, Maria was named one of Time's 100 most influential climate leaders, and I think Aron has long been, I would say, in the top 10 advising on these issues. So I don't think I did either of them justice, but maybe if we stop sharing slides, we can start, Aron, with you, and then Maria, talking about your backgrounds and really given where we are with sustainability and ESG today, what are BSR and We Mean Business respectively doing? Aron?
Thank you for the very generous introduction, Suze. Great to work with you, who is also an amazing leader in this area, and great to be with you, Maria, as well. Look, I think it's obvious that the world is changing in some fundamental ways, economically, politically, geopolitically, technology, culture, etc. And what we're trying to do in 2025 is stay true to the need to work towards a just and sustainable economy, but do so in the context that has new features than it has for the 30 plus years since BSR was founded in 1992. And so, what does that mean? That means a bit more of a focus on business value, because at a time when there are pressures and headwinds for sustainability as it's been practiced, it's essential that companies know that their commitments to sustainability can help make them better businesses. So that's important. Another thing that we're looking at is trying to understand the impact and help shape the impact of the new technologies. DeepSeek notwithstanding, is rocketed into everyone's consciousness over the last 48 hours. The new technologies are creating what Brad Smith of Microsoft called both tools and weapons. How can we ensure that they're developed and deployed in ways that benefit people, don't interfere with human rights, and also that create and accelerate the energy transition, even at a time when AI is creating a lot of hunger for new sources of energy. The last thing I would say is, or the last way we're thinking about a different approach is, and Maria and I were both at the World Economic Forum last week, and including joining some meetings jointly, where the notion of a new narrative, we need a new narrative. You alluded to moving away from ESG, talking about responsible business, sustainable business, resilient business. We need to create a new narrative, because while we've done a lot better, we who work on sustainable business, in the past few years, talking about the real economy, we don't do a good job of talking about this in a way that resonates with real people. And so that's something that I think we really need to pay more attention to, because the public has lost faith in some of what we're advocating. The public believes that this is an agenda that is imposed on them by elites. A chief sustainability officer in our network made a great comment to us. She said, at a time when middle-class families are struggling to get by, the rhetoric we use sounds like a bunch of empty slogans. And I think that says it very, very well. So new framework conditions, new technologies, new narratives, all important. And for BSR, as always, we work with our member companies delivering insight, advice, and collaboration.
Yeah, the terminology, we'll come back to it at the end, is just really important, because somehow we've missed out. I just got back from North Carolina, and the people who resent the elites and the agenda the most are those also going to be the most harmed in the United States and around the world, as the climate continues to change, whatever we call it. And Maria, love to turn it over to you to tell us a little bit about the role of We Mean Business.
Well, thank you, and thank you both, Aron and you, Susan, for inviting me to be in this podcast. I'm connected from Geneva, Switzerland, where we don't even know who's the prime minister, because it changes every 2 years, it rotates. And so it's a very stable political environment, and it shows how a country, can innovate, even if it's one of the smallest countries in Europe, and it's renovating itself all the time. When Women Business was created, and it was created thanks to our own leadership, amongst other partners at Women Business, he was the one that introduced Women Business at the Climate Week 10 years ago. It was created to drive the most progressive or advanced or forward-thinking businesses. I think also terminology changes depending where you speak about it, but basically those companies that are serious about taking climate action. At the beginning, one of the first things we did was created an initiative that is called the Science Based Targets Initiative. And there was a dozen of companies that signed to it. Well, I have to say that last week, as Trump was leaving the Paris Agreement, we hit a record in the number of companies that are committed to science and to the Paris Agreement, 20,000. Okay, and this amount is growing all the time. So probably by the end of this week, it will be 21,000, because it is unstoppable. Companies see that climate is a big risk for them, and also a huge opportunity. And so while the US is a very important player in the world scheme of things, we see a lot of progress happening elsewhere as well. In Europe, with many countries having more than half of the power produced with renewables, and in China, that is just like way ahead of the rest. And so I find that it's useful to put things into the context. The energy transition is unstoppable for the very simple reasons that renewables are the cheaper energy source around the world. Maybe there are some exceptions, but they are, available. It is one with high capital cost at the beginning, but then is zero cost for the life of the installation, and that's why it's booming. EVs, I was told last week, 7 times cheaper to drive an EV in the UK than a conventional car. And this is true, and whoever has an EV can see that. Then it depends on how much gasoline is subsidized. So basically, the market, is showing a different image. And I'm saying this all the time, we need to look at market fundamentals to see the opportunity. Of course, if we talk about green hydrogen, of course, it's more expensive, but maybe, should we talk about green hydrogen when we can electrify so many energy uses? Let me stop here because we have a lot to discuss. But anyway, as you see, I come from an energy background and I'm bringing that energy to the conversation.
Yeah, and thank you. The science-based targets, even Morrison Foerster and most companies and firms and investors around the world have set that, and relying on science and going back to the sort of original sources of science to give us the data to make the informed decisions is just, I think, critical. I'll also just say, one of the most impactful things I worked on in 2024 was the Green Market Maker with JP Morgan and Bezos and some others, which is a market-led solution that is, taking government or philanthropic dollars to absorb a green premium to make a market in the hard to decarbonize. But while 2024 had a lot of bright spots in terms of innovation, there are also some lessons learned. This session is going to be looking ahead to 2025, but maybe we could stop and pause for both of you to just look back at 2024 and particularly the election, particularly the US and sort of headwinds. And I know the headwinds are stronger here in the US, but they do have reverberations around the world. And comment a little bit about what are some of the takeaways from 2024 before we go to 2025. Maria, you want to start or?
Well, sure. I think I don't have the same US perspective that you have. And certainly from a geopolitical perspective, 2024 has been a very hard year. We have a war in Gaza, and we have seen the horrors of that. The Ukrainian war we haven't seen the end of it. We see a lot of geopolitical instability. And then, yes, I find we have seen extreme events hitting Valencia, which is my country, Spain, where people, just many people died because, they were not prepared for it. It was really unexpected and very strong. And then it is in your minds what happened in the US with the hurricanes and LA. So we live in a very complex world. Yet, companies are staying the course because they understand that if there is a problem, the first thing they can do is to start to find solutions to it. And so I was very pleased last week in Davos when I heard leaders, from Amazon, from Google, from Microsoft, from hard-to-abate sectors saying, we're going to stay the course. Of course, it's going to be complicated in some instances. Why are they staying the course? Because, we did some work with potential energy and we polled in different jurisdictions across the political spectrum. And then we saw that actually the majority of people, 70 to 80%, depending on the geographies, across Republicans, Democrats, all parties, understand that climate change is a huge risk and also understand that and are in favor of clean solutions. They would buy from and work for and speak well for companies that act on and invest on clean solutions. Now here, the issue of language is critical, especially in the US. They will support clean solutions, not climate change solutions, because that doesn't resonate well with Republicans. And they will understand the extreme weather events, but not the climate change events. So there is a language issue here that we need to sort out. Hence, the big lesson is while climate change is the biggest threat that humanity faces, it's still being used by political parties, in one side or the other. and is making so much harm and noise when we should be focusing on solving this problem. And so I have always said that climate change, or however you want to call it, is not an ideology, it's a scientific reality, and one that needs to be responded by science. And the soonest we start to remove this from the political fight, the better.
No, I agree. The climate is changing, whatever we want, however we want to call it. Aron, why don't you comment more from a U.S. perspective, but businesses that are either based here or have some intersection with the U.S. What is advice? What are sort of lessons learned from the election 2024, and how is it changing things going forward to 2025?
So if you think about 2024 as the year of elections around the world, more people voted in national elections in 2024 than any other year in human history. Incumbent parties lost vote share everywhere. So as much as we see the change in the United States as being dramatic, and it is dramatic, and it is consequential, actually the loss of vote share by the Democratic Party was substantially smaller than in almost every other major economy where elections took place. So I think there sometimes is a bit of a disconnect between headlines and history. And I think the underlying changes that are happening continue apace. So Andrew Steer, who heads the Bezos Earth Fund, said at COP, elections change many things, but they don't change physics. I would add that they don't change demographics either. Why do I say that? As both of you said, Maria and Suze, climate is a matter of science. It's happening and doesn't care, who's in the White House and who controls Congress. It's happening, and we've got to deal with it. In the U.S. context, as much as war has been declared on the three letters DEI, BSR should probably change from something else because it seems like three-letter acronyms are just in the line of fire these days. DEI, the fact is America's getting more diverse by the hour. And to deny that, to pull back from that, it is bad for business. And I think we've seen a lot of companies, yes, change some of their programs, but many companies, Costco, one example, Jamie Dimon at Davos gave a full-throated defense of JP Morgan Chase's approach to diversity. These are things that are about your workforce, that are about your customers. You can't afford to alienate your investors, your customers, and your employees. If you do that, you're going to be out of business. You also can't alienate science, right? So I think there is still some underlying things that are moving in a positive direction. A recent poll, I think it was Deloitte, might have been EY, I'll give them both credit. Only one of them deserves it, but both credit, did a survey recently that said that 61% of Americans employed by companies think their businesses should be doing more to address climate and diversity, more, not less. And so I think there's a risk of overreading some of the election results. I don't mean to minimize the implications, they're huge. But in times of apparent social progress, there are always things that are going in the wrong direction. And at times when it might seem like progress isn't anywhere to be found, there are many good things that are happening. And from our work with boards of directors, yeah, they're intensely focused on what's happening because there's so much change going on that companies have to attend to that. But they also know that some of the things that we're talking about today are defining success for business, defining resilience for business, defining innovation for business. And that's continuing on. And the companies that don't embrace that are going to look up one day and find that they've put themselves in a pretty difficult position. So I think a little bit of caution. Things are never as good as they seem when they seem like they're going in the right direction. Things are maybe not as dire as they sometimes might seem. And I think the underlying reasons why businesses are focusing on what we used to call ESG are every bit as present today as they were a year ago, 5 years ago.
No, I think that's a very good point. I'd love for both of you to comment on, what are how have priorities changed if they have for 2025? I mean, I hear reframing, but continued focus on risk, resilience, and innovation. And what are some of the wild cards? Like
Hmm.
what's going to happen in 2025 that could, move the needle in one direction or the other? Aron, why don't we start with you and then go to Maria?
Sure. I mean, there are always black swans. I would focus on the gray swans, the things that, um, we think may happen, but we don't know when, we don't know how, we don't know where. I was struck, and not in a good way, in Davos last week by hearing three people in events that I participated in raise the specter of more armed conflict, whether in Europe or between the US and China. And will that happen? Hard to say. If it does, when, where, don't know. But I think most geopolitical analysts would say that the risk of even more armed conflict, notwithstanding Ukraine and Gaza, and not to mention Sudan and Myanmar and other places that the media don't pay as much attention to, that risk is very present, and that could be catastrophic. I believe that what John Elkington has called the sustainability recession, a bit of a pullback on sustainability, will change when we have signal events that tap us on the shoulder and remind us why this is so important. I mean, I would hate to predict another Katrina. I would hate to predict another George Floyd case. But my guess is we'll see things like that happen. And so, and those things have a way of changing public attitudes. So I think it's really the gray swans. I think AI is a huge wild card. I I participated in a lot of discussions last week on that and am not hearing a lot of answers about what people think the implications of this really will be. And I think that tells me that there's one of two things happening, maybe both. Both of them would be wild cards. One is people don't know, and we've seen some evidence of that with some of the companies that we work with who are building these tools, that it's changing so fast that they're not 100% sure what the implications will be. The other alternative is that they do know, but they don't want to say because it's a little too daunting. So, technology, events, geopolitical conflict, they're all right there, and I think they will, when we look back on the second half of the 2020s, I think we'll say, oh yeah, in retrospect, we should have seen these things coming.
Maria, would you like to comment on that and also maybe say a few words about COP30?
Sure. So I think in addition to what Aron has very well explained, this morning I saw an analysis from Lauri Milvirta. So it's about China. So, we tend to think, the thing is that we tend to think that there is a debate on something, that this is about a trade war between China and the US or whatever. But the reality is that China exports 70% of its growth has happened in developing countries. And between 2010 and 2015, around 70% of solar and 50% of wind was in developed countries, so in US, Europe. Well, now it's only 20%. So when you look at the graphs of China investment in electric vehicles, you know that 1 every 2 cars or more are electric now. You can see that the Chinese car manufacturers are just their production is skyrocketing for the domestic market, which means reducing the imports from European and American companies and exporting probably mainly to also developing countries. And I find that we just need to very closely monitor what's happening there. And then yesterday we saw this new ChatGPT, the Chinese version of it, which is much cheaper and probably, I don't know if better or not. I'm not an expert. So I find we just need to look and through the noise to what I say, the market fundamentals and where growth is happening. And growth is happening a lot in the energy transition because it makes good economic sense, and especially in a country that stays the course, that don't change every 4 years, right? And so I find that we just, yes, I hope, companies and also countries, realize that what is happening here, that there's going to be such a distance between some countries, that are staying the course and others. I find that gives me hope, because I think competition is a very good way for companies and for countries to advance. And I find the race is on. Now, regarding COP30, well, it's quite interesting. I think because it will take place in the Amazon. And that's the other side. We will see, hopefully, a lot of investments in nature-based solutions that have multiple benefits. I find it's going to be, one of the last things that probably Lula and even the Secretary General of the UN will do. So I would not be surprised, and I have heard, about them coming with some new initiative that might be, groundbreaking in some form on climate side, because that would be their legacy. So it's a very important COP, because countries need to present their national plans for the next 5 years. And of course, what is happening in the US doesn't help raise the ambition. But we will see. And certainly for the business community, it's going to be a very interesting COP. And I think many businesses will go if they find a place to stay in Belém.
Do you have further thoughts on COP30 before we move on, Aron?
Yeah, so I have a slightly contrarian view about the United States withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. As much as it pains me as an American citizen to see my country stand outside of such an important process, I actually think under this administration, they would do more harm than good for the COP process because of the governance, the requirement of consensus for decisions. I don't think that the United States government under this leadership would be a constructive force there. So I think it's bad for America, but possibly good for the overall process, not having the United States in there. Now, you can poke a lot of holes in that argument, but I have a feeling that that's the case. The United States, after all, is the largest fossil fuel producer in the world. And I think under this government, it's far more likely that the U.S. would align with Saudi Arabia and some others to interfere with ambitious agreements rather than advancing them. So, and then just underlining the whole, as Maria says, the United States is not the whole world. And I would argue that the federal government is not the entirety of the United States. And we see businesses, we see investors, we see cities and states all continuing to take action. And so, take out the United States, well, you've still got the fifth biggest economy in the world right here in California. And California continues to exercise a level of ambition that's important. So I think it's deeply unfortunate, but not fatal. And maybe given the circumstances on balance, net positive that we won't have this administration interfering with agreements in Belém.
I'll go forward. And as you said, I'm sitting here in California, and at least 7 other states have said that they're going to follow California, at least in terms of disclosure and increased requirements. So it's going to be an interesting time for business. And let's turn to sort of both of you coalition building, Aron working with thousands of companies, but hundreds of large US based and multinational corporations. What are your, as a coalition builder, BSR, what are your objectives for them in 2024? Sorry, 2025. I'm not going backwards. And I particularly like you to comment on sort of how to balance climate focused work with social and economic challenges.
So first, philosophically, BSR has always believed that coalitions are important. The issues we work on, climate and nature, human rights, diversity, corporate governance, these are systemic questions that require systemic answers. The role of company leadership is crucial, but the best companies know that real progress requires collaboration. Right now, I would say there's reasons why it's more important and reasons why it's more challenged. So why is it more important? We've been seeing that amidst all the chaos, frankly, in the external environment, we've seen companies want to talk with to some degree us, but also with each other more and more and more to make sense of a challenging environment and recognizing that strength in numbers is important at a time when greenwashing enforcement is on the rise. There's a desire for companies maybe to have other institutions or coalitions speak for them or speak on various issues rather than individual companies and business leaders subjecting themselves to pushback. On the other hand, we know that antitrust laws are now being wielded as a weapon to interfere with collaboration. We've seen withdrawals from a lot of the investor networks and so on. So it's a tricky time, but I think that speaks more to how these collaborations advance, not whether. We work on all sorts of things on climate. I'll let Maria take that forward. The We Mean Business Coalition is a really important partnership for us. We're proud to be a part of it. We also work on women's empowerment in global supply chains, implementation on the UN guiding principles on human rights. Our largest collaboration has over 100 companies in it called the Future of Reporting. With all the changes in reporting and disclosure requirements, it's an exceptionally dynamic group. So these are the things that we're focused on, and collaboration has been, is, and always will be a core part of the toolkit. And I think any organization that's serious about making progress needs to have collaboration as in its toolbox.
Thanks. And before we move on, there is some background noise. Ernie, I'm hoping you can take care of that. Aron, there are also questions that we're getting, and you guys in the audience, feel free. I started monitoring questions at 9:30, and I'm going to pepper them in. But before we move back to climate and really more of sort of the international perspective and the EU perspective, could you comment on a question about the pullback, specifically on social agendas, specifically CEOs and DEI, not Jamie Dimon, but everybody else that is being influenced by kind of Johnny Starbuck. And I think the question is really, okay, we've been working on this for decades and we arrived, where we are, and a few tweets seem to be sending everybody back. It's more than that. I mean, there is litigation that has been, carefully, strategically crafted to go after these issues. But comments from you, Aron, on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think of the movie Mean Girls. I feel like we're living in a Mean Girls world where Robbie Starbuck is imposing his will, and quite successfully, frankly. The Wall Street Journal had a video interview with him, which I would recommend people watching. You get some insight into his thinking. I think it's a really unfortunate part of our world right now. I think there's a lot of scapegoating that's going on. Again, the underlying reasons for diversity and inclusion are solid. Has there been some overreach in some cases? Sure. I mean, some issues, transgender rights are hard for some people to digest, and so I think there are complications. I think the backlash on DEI is being successful in part because a lot of people feel economically vulnerable. If you feel like the pie is shrinking and someone else has the opportunity to claim your slice of the pie, you're going to be subjected to that. So let me kind of raise the ante on this one and say, I think companies need to do a better job of understanding and appreciating the degree to which people feel economically vulnerable right now, whether it's around income inequality or the changing nature of work, all the disruption we've been to, the fact that the social safety net hasn't really been modernized for the 21st century. Those conditions make it easy for people to make DEI a target. So I think that's one piece of it. Obviously, the Supreme Court's ruling not that long ago, big part of this as well. I would argue, and Suze, you can speak to this more fully than I can, but I think we're going to start seeing some lawsuits challenging companies for discriminatory practices. And if I used to be a lawyer, I used to work at MoFo, very proud of that. If I were a plaintiff's employment law attorney right now, I would be focusing on the companies that have made these very visible U-turns and go find some people who've been let go, women, people of color, etc. And you put the CEO on the stand and talk about the signals that he or she is sending about pulling back from DEI. Jury may not like that very much. So I think you're going to start to see a backlash to the backlash in some circumstances. So I think companies need to think long and hard about sustaining their commitments, not only to values, but to practices that are consistent with the law on this.
And I'll just note we have a DEI task force with the one firm where we have, civil rights, human rights, diversity, employment, and corporate all together advising. And you're exactly right. Our clients are starting to experience risk and litigation threats from both sides, and it's related to climate in the U.S. and it's specific to DEI and DEI programs. But let's leave the U.S. Let's leave the US and go back to Maria. And we did have one question before we move on to sort of the EU framework. And that was from somebody in our audience who said, aren't SBTI targets just checklists? I would love for you to comment on that because we have moved just from sort of voluntary compliance to a lot of regulatory compliance, particularly in the EU, which you're going to comment on, but there is still real value in using the science-based targets. But I'd like you to sort of articulate what that is.
Yeah, sure. So, well, companies, the first thing that companies do obviously is to measure their emissions. And once they measure, they can manage. The next step is for companies to set science-based targets, which we call science-based because they are linked to what the Paris Agreement says that needs to happen. Many companies have gone through this process. By doing both, companies are able to better manage their emissions, which means energy, which means money. And so all in all, the benefits for companies have been really good. Now, is it easy to set a science-based target and to meet it? No, it's very hard because there are many barriers that do not relate to the business activity. I think that for some, for banks and financial institutions, the fact, they will check whether you have an SBTI, yes, no, and then they will include you in one or another category. So it has become de facto like an approval, no, for companies that want to invest in companies that are doing well on climate. Now, I haven't seen that this is going to be regulated to be mandatory but we might see that, I don't know. I think the science-based targets is going through a review of the net zero standard, and that's going to shed more light and facilitate companies when addressing the Scope 3 emissions and what they call beyond value chain mitigation, which has been an area that has been quite difficult and contentious equally. And I hope and I find that, they're going definitely in the right direction. Because it's a standard, it needs to go through consultation, and also let me tell the audience that they can go and provide feedback when available, and that feedback will be very much welcome. I think what is happening in that sense, I'm extending myself, but I find it's kind of quite incredible what the SBTI had achieved, because the Scope 3, and I saw it in Davos. So the Scope 3 of companies are the Scope 1 of other companies, and vice versa. So I was in a meeting where we had, the aluminium producer that wanted to sell clean aluminium to Volvo, but on the other hand, wanted to buy, clean cars from Volvo. Let me stop here because I need to drink.
That's very helpful. And while you're having a sip, I'd like you to further comment, that while that the US is completely schizophrenic in terms of push and pull, depending on what state you are, depending on state versus federal versus local. The EU policies have been sort of consistent in terms of moving for greater compliance and greater disclosure. Can you talk about how sort of the EU policy and regulation are shaping climate strategies for business globally in the US, but everywhere? If you're ready.
Sure. I'm sorry about this. Well, I think the European Union is at the moment working through what is called the omnibus, which is trying to streamline some of the regulations. that have been created for for different purposes. And I think it's quite interesting because some parties or companies are using this as a mechanism to reduce the ambition of some of these regulations. So we think that mainstreaming, simplifying is fundamental, but the legal framework should remain. I think any company, American company that operates in Europe of certain size will have to comply with these regulations. And I understand that also in California, they're quite advanced in some of these and similarly pushing for similar things. And then we have ISSB at the global level that is trying to set that pace. I think it's hard to know. I mean, now also in Europe, the other big thing is the Clean Industrial Pact. There's going to be launched on the 26th of February, where they will announce, what do they want to do regarding improving the competitiveness of European companies in the current context. It's a very difficult thing to do at this moment when also from the US we hear noise about trade barriers, etc. And what I find that if that happens and trade taxes are put in place, that might push Europe to be united and stronger, and might push for some more harmonization of fiscal regimes across Europe, and also, supporting the European industry. As I say, this is not like a US-Europe game. It is a China, the rest of the world game. And so one, needs to carefully draft the different trade measures. Yes, has to protect the industry, but on the other hand, has to allow the industry to grow and to compete. And so, for example, if we protect the car manufacturers, then they won't be able to compete internationally. And so, there is a fine balance that needs to be found in creating the mechanism, incentives, and policies that will facilitate that innovation so that companies can compete in the world stage and not be just very protected. No? Now, and lastly, I mean, any trade, new taxes and and new impositions of local content and things like that, will inevitably increase inflation as well. So I find it is difficult, to do for Europe a new industrial policy in the middle of this hurricane that we have at the moment. But
yeah, it's a good way to think about the hurricane, the winds from, yes.
Exactly. But honestly, Ursula von der Leyen, and I was lucky enough to listen to her in Davos, and they are very firmly staying the course because they know that decarbonizing and growing the European industry is fundamental for Europe and for the world. So I'm confident in that regard. But yeah, let's see what happens. Thanks.
And I'm tracking CBAM really closely because the combination of tariffs versus, and embedding, an emission calculation per product, I think is fascinating. But Aron, go ahead.
Yeah, just two brief points on that. One is American companies sometimes think Europe is the outlier. It's not. As of last Monday, the United States became the outlier when it comes to reporting and disclosure rules and regulations and so on. Because it's not just Europe, it is indeed, as Maria says, the rest of the world. I will say I heard a number of things last week to the effect of watch the German elections, February 23rd, because there are signs that the likely lead party that will almost certainly win, the Christian Democrats, that have many people who are downright hostile to some of the regulatory framework that's part of the omnibus that Maria mentioned. So I think the direction of travel remains as it has been. I think the pace and ambition of it, I think it is also subject to political questions in Europe right now.
It's a really good point. If I could make just sort of a legal note, one of the things, when the first regs came out in the EU and the accounting firms are, spend 10 million, do a full in-depth, double materiality analysis, you've got to comply. I was like, I'm sure those rules are going to change. And so this just necessitates the need to work with folks like the two of you in these coalitions of really focusing not on this area as a compliance exercise, but as, what are the elements that are key to your business and your operations and making those kind of smart decisions. But if you have more
Yeah,
questions, go ahead.
yeah, I would like to add on this because I was on the train to Davos and I met the CEO of Heidelberg Materials, who I've known for many years, and we spoke about this, about reporting, and he says, it's been so hard, and even if the requirement is reduced, I'm going to keep up with the current requirements, because look, and then he came out with the iPad, and then he showed me a full mapping of the sales of low carbon cement across geographies, and says, well, thanks to that reporting, now I can monitor the progress and the sales, and I can say, okay, what's going on this market, what's happening, etc. So this across the board, yes, is painful, but once you measure, you can manage. And as I said before, it brings a lot of benefit, but there is an investment that is required by all companies, whether it is required or not by regulation, which will help you do a better business, no? and grasp the opportunities, as he was saying.
That's right. So let's just cover off again. If you have questions, we've answered a couple of them already. Please put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and I will monitor. But we've talked a little bit about policy. I want to turn, because Aron, you mentioned it briefly, and have you comment on technology. And then I want to go to market forces, Maria. So changing it up just a little bit. So on the technology side, talk about the intersection of this space, sustainable, responsible business, and how it may be harmed by or helped by the ability to really rapidly deploy generative AI.
Well, as I said earlier, I'm not sure who has a full picture of this. Maybe if we had Sam Altman, he might be able to help us out a little bit. But I think there are a lot of different ways to look at it. So one is that there's issues related to employment. There's issues related to information quality integrity. There are issues having to do with the environmental footprint, climate footprint, of all the compute power that's needed. There are issues related to governance, and I say that both in terms of corporate governance, but also public governance, who's setting the rules. So the complexities are large and growing. I think there is the risk that technologies create further income inequality. There is an impact on diversity, so-called hallucinations, DeepSeek, the tools coming from different places. DeepSeek appears to be a great tool when it comes to energy consumption, but someone had the brilliant idea to ask DeepSeek what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989, and the response was, I cannot answer that question. I am here to provide, I think it was helpful and refreshing information. The question was posed, has China committed any war crimes? No answer. Question asked about the United States. You got an answer about the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. So is DeepSeek a good thing or a bad thing? Well, you tell me, because it apparently brings the promise of driving down the footprint of all of this, but the information integrity is not there. I had the privilege last week of participating in a dialogue with the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, sponsored by one of the big tech companies. And we got into a really interesting question about what sort of queries you could or couldn't answer and who decides. So there are a lot of dilemmas. My concern is that we are making the same mistake that was made in the first wave of internet and social media, except the implications are exponential. By that, I mean the race for market share is on. I understand that. No company can go to its shareholders and say, well, we're going to take a more cautious approach and let our competitors bring this technology to market. Can't do that if you're a publicly traded company, but we are going to move fast and break even more things this time around. And so it gives me a great deal of pause. Now, there are obvious benefits here. Are the benefits being overstated? I don't know. I don't think I think we can see the challenges more easily than the benefits right now. And I I think we almost need we need more global cooperation and more cooperation between the public and private sectors to be able to create a set of rules that will allow the benefits of these technologies to flourish. We want it, we need it, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. Why would we want that? But there's some pretty big questions here. And I would say, by the way, we are going to be in the forefront of biotechnology innovation at an increasing pace as well, and that's going to raise a whole other set of questions. So, um, you know, interesting times ahead is the best I can say. I think it's very hard to be black and white about this.
Yeah, but you would agree that most companies have some focus in this area. Everybody's watching it,
Oh,
and it will have an impact. I would say one positive thing for 2025 is, I've been long working on corporate forms and governance and structures, mainly for climate, like the Public Benefit Corporation, like using a PPT, i.e. Patagonia. I have been heartened that many of the AI companies have been taking that playbook and adopting a a governance model that does not, drive shareholder returns at the cost of all else. So I think there are some pockets of good news, but I think a lot of us we'll see. It's certainly going to be a big trend. Maria, if you wanted to comment on that, but we only have a couple minutes left, and I did want to make sure before I gave you guys a chance to have closing remarks, talk about, in addition to policy and technology, there are also market forces, significant market forces that have been driving toward greater decarbonization, greater renewable energy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I think for countries that do not produce fossil fuels, the transition to clean energy that is renewable and is locally produced is a big incentive. So I mentioned before China, it's the case in Europe, in many countries. In fact, I come from a country, Spain, where we had, I think, almost 80% of fossil-free electricity generation. Now, here, the issue is that we need to electrify the energy users. That's the next wave that needs to happen. And there are many barriers for that. And also, I suppose that the consumer is not aware of the benefits of that transition. And so consumer behavior and understanding it, it's going to take a while. I'm hopeful because we have seen how, smartphones have been picked up, right? It is also about providing the solutions to the people in a way that they can understand and they can use. No? And I had dinner with the CEO of Octopus, which is a big retailer in the UK, has become the biggest retailer by simply optimizing the uses of energy across the board. And it's quite fascinating to see, how a company can grow in such a short period of time. So, there are different ways of innovation. We have renewables, EVs, and batteries that have gone, that are at a point where they are incrementally being used and scaled because the economics make sense. There are other technologies that will come afterwards, the next wave of innovation where we need to invest in the first phases. Now, I think there is a huge opportunities for companies, and we're seeing it, and that's why companies in Davos and elsewhere, with the recent announcement that says we're going to stay the course because it makes business economic sense. Now, there's going to be some confusion because people, companies that are not living and are not aware of these market trends might listen and say, oh, it is the new oil renaissance. And they might make very wrong choices. Because if you invest in fossil fuel generation, production, or whatever, it is a stranded cost because we know that the other technology is going to pick up, and the next government, when there is a change in government, the legislation will change. So I find that it's just so important that companies invest freely, and they invest in, they follow the market trends, and they're very careful on looking at the long term to see where they make their investment choices. No? And I think that the consumers want this as well, and that's what we are hearing across the board in many geographies, across the political spectrum. Citizens are very willing to invest in clean solutions. They also are willing to follow someone that can provide an easy solution for them to be part of the solution as well. And let me stop here.
Yeah, so in our last, I'll give you each 1 minute. One sort of important piece of advice or guidance for businesses 2025. Aron.
So we talked about terminology at the start. For me, one of the ways to describe this work is at the intersection of business and society. So companies should be focusing, how do I deliver value for my business and how do I deliver value for society? Put those two sentences on a poster at your desk. Think about them every minute.
Great. Maria?
In addition to what Aron has said, that I fully agree, collaboration is going to be fundamental. I think working with like-minded companies and bringing a unified voice in certain moments is going to be very important to push for this agenda, because it makes business sense. It's in the interest of business. So don't shy away from speaking and from continue to invest in what you think is right for your company. And as Aron said, any responsible business know that they need to work, to make money and to maintain the planet and the people, that are fundamental for business. So this is quite the basic, 1.0 for business, to be responsible. And I find that the moment calls for business to really be responsible.
Well, thank you both very much for this scintillating conversation. I'm sure we will be continuing this. And just for the audience, in 2 weeks, or a little more than 2 weeks, we're going to be having a session with one of the world's foremost experts on climate litigation. So we're going to be doing a deeper dive just to really understand the landscape and understand, sort of the positives resulting from that climate litigation in terms of change, but also, costs and compliance and risk to companies and investors. So, Aron and Maria, thank you so much, and we will see you all soon. Bye.